Our next panel, Alternative Energy and Sustainability, What Can We Expect? Or as I've been better educated, what really would refer to as new energy from that standpoint. So I'm going to introduce, this panel is going to be led by Prajit Ghosh of Wood Mackenzie. And Prajit leads, he's kind of the yin and yang tar tea from that standpoint, in that he leads their global team responsible developing and commercializing WoodMac's views on the power and renewable markets, and his current focus is on energy market transition and the disruptive impact of emerging technologies in this new energy space. And he also leads WoodMac's thought leadership in this space. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Prajit to introduce his panelists and go from here. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Del. So yeah, the green energy guys are here, I guess. Just as a quick intro, we've got a great esteemed panel here that can cover the breadth and depth of issues that we'll talk about. But just I wanted to talk about why we conceived of this panel, and we called it Alternative Energy. But really the idea is there's this radical growth that we've seen in alternative technologies, that's wind and solar and storage. And you've probably heard a lot about electric cars. So, and really the idea is that these technologies and how fast they're growing will drive this sort of transition away from fossil fuels to renewables. At least that's the theory. Now, my name is Prajit Ghosh, and as Del said, thank you, Del, I lead up our Wood Mackenzie's Global Power Renewables Emerging Technologies practice. But part of my job is to sit at the intersection of folks who look at fossil fuels and folks who look at renewables technologies. It's not the best position to be at, because I get to come to conferences like this where there's a good bit of oil and gas audience and tell them how their business could get disrupted. And then I go talk to renewables folks and talk about how they'll face a lot of challenges too. So it's not the best recipe to earn a lot of friends. And I'll introduce the panel if they can just hold on for 2 minutes. I just wanted to run a few slides to talk through what these trends are and how this transition will actually take place if it does. And so being in my job, I should say that fossil fuels and renewable technologies are at this, from my point of view, are at this inexorable collision course. And a large part of the reason for that is that these are two largely different ecosystems. They talk different languages, and given where these technologies are today, it becomes supremely important for that language to have a common vocabulary. So hopefully this will get us to bridge that gap a little bit. So, again, I won't go through the details of each of these slides, and that's why these panelists who know a lot more about this than I do will talk about. But if you look at this chart, what we did in this chart is, when you're investing in new fossil fuel technologies for power generation purposes or renewables, you're spending X amount of dollars in capital. There's a cost of operating these facilities. So we sort of levelized the capital costs and the operating costs, and we started so we can compare these technologies against each other. And what you'll see here is a whole bunch of these dotted lines, which are mostly horizontal, and a lot of solid lines, which are declining through the past few years. And all of the lines that are declining are essentially different types of solar technologies or wind technologies. All the lines that are horizontal are gas technologies, coal, nuclear, right? So you can see that even today, if you sort of look at 2018, and this is for Texas, so I took that example, solar and wind are arguably cheaper than fossil technologies. Now there's tax credits, and we'll talk about all of that. But really, the one takeaway from this slide is, this whole idea that these technologies are on the periphery of things is certainly not true. They're pretty much the mainstream today, and that's why we're here. And the other is, it's not just about solar and wind technologies, right? There's other emerging technologies that are increasingly coming into the sort of mainstream area. And one of those is storage. and battery systems. So why are we talking about battery systems so much? And if you're in the oil industry and you're looking at electric cars, the battery technologies obviously are a big driver of that. So I could have put a forecast in here, but I didn't want to do that because if somebody comes and tells you I know a battery cost forecast going out 20 years, I would take your wallet and run. But this sort of slide makes the point. So this is a forecast that the EIA did back in 2012. So they were sitting on the table, figuring out what the battery cost should be in the next 20-odd years, right? And there's two lines here. One is sort of their reference case, and another one is their high technology case. And if you know how EIA does their high technology case, they're pretty liberal about assuming new technologies. Now, so that's what they forecasted back in 2012, right? And if you look at 2016, and you look at those little asterisks or the plus signs and circles, those are actual cost of battery packs that are being talked about today, that we know have already happened, arguably. So what does that tell you, right? So that says that what EIA thought in their high technology case would happen in 20 years has already happened, right? So that's why it's caught a lot of people by surprise how fast these technologies are growing. And finally, so, when you think about this, so we talked about renewables costs and we talk about emerging technologies. And that's sort of one side of this transition, is the cost of these technologies and how fast they're growing. The other side is sort of how are you going to disrupt oil and gas, if at all? So I just wanted to map out with sets of framework as to how this transition will take place, if it does. Now, you think about smartphones, and this is not a one-to-one comparison, but sort of makes the point, I think. You think about smartphones, right? When you take directions on your GPS, you're not thinking MapQuest anymore. It's gone. When you're, I don't know if there's a torch industry, but when you use your flashlights on your phone, then you can think about the sheer impacts it's had on the torch industry or the supply chain of that. So that's how smartphones have changed it. So so you always, when you talk about disruption, you need some sort of a disruptive vehicle that can expedite the pace of transition. And that to us is what power markets or electricity markets will serve within the energy sector. And again, I'm sure there's folks here for whom this is pretty basic, but just for the benefit of all, when you talk about the electricity market, it's not a combustible fuel like coal or gas or oil. It's sort of a clearinghouse for multiple fuels, right? That's why the circle. You think of it as a pie chart, where all these fuels are competing against each other: coal, natural gas, nuclear, renewables, that's energy efficiency, solar, wind, storage, everything, right? And you're sort of fighting for this sort of big generation pie. And at least in the US context, we don't really use oil for power generation purposes. 90% of coal is used within power generation, 90%. 30 to 40% of gas is used in power generation. But oil was sort of a totally different ecosystem. But now with electrification of transport, you're basically taking all that energy you consume for transport purposes and putting it into the electricity sector. So that's sort of the role of the electricity markets. And really the global transition, it sits on two pillars. One is the cost of renewables and emerging techs. And the second pillar is let's electrify everything that we can, whether it's transport or space heating, and then let's get more renewables to generate that electricity. So in an indirect sense, you're running everything through renewables. With that, I'll stop, and I just wanted to spend maybe 2 minutes talking, just if the panel wouldn't mind introducing themselves. Jason, if you don't mind.
Hi, guys. My name is Jason Ballard. I'm actually a Gulf Coast native, so it's great to be here. I grew up near the Beaumont area. I'm an entrepreneur, and my first venture is a company called Treehouse. That is a home upgrade company focused on the do-it-for-me market with an underlying mission of health and sustainability. The funny way to say that is imagine Whole Foods took over Home Depot and added services, and you're mostly there. And then my second venture is also in the built environment, and it's a company called Icon that 3D prints houses.
I'm John Berger, CEO of Sunnova Energy Corporation. We are a residential solar service and now storage service company that operates from Guam, Saipan, all the way through California, Texas, Puerto Rico, and up to Massachusetts. We operate through a dealer network, the same way that a DirecTV or an ADT would, where we have locally owned and operated contractors that go out and source our customers, sign them up to our long-term contracts, and then install the equipment to our specifications, our equipment on their homes. And then we service those customers. So anything that goes wrong, we fix it. We obviously answer any questions, billing, repairs. And a good example of it is Puerto Rico recently. We've fixed, or in the process of completing a fix of the entire fleet, and it didn't cost our customers one penny. So we're a power company, and as the storage, which I'm sure we'll get into, gets more and more powerful and cheaper quickly, and I can add some to that, essentially we're wireless power. That's what's happening.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jorge Hardy. I'm Vice President of Business Development for Pattern Energy. We specialize in the development, finance, operation of large-scale commercial wind and solar power plants. We also do a lot of transmission-enabled business. We are kind of in the medium side of the IPP sector, the renewable side. We have a portfolio of approximately 3,000 megawatts of wind and solar projects. That represents a portfolio of about $5 billion. We have a public company that's listed on the NASDAQ called PEGI, is Pattern Energy Group. And then we have a private DevCo that is funded by a combination of institutional funding and from Canada and U.S. funds, and that's the side that I run the business development from. So I'm on a different side of the energy business. I'm more on the utilities side of the power business than these gentlemen. And, oh, shit. Cardinal sin. Sorry. So where was I?
Other side of the industry.
I'm on the other side of the industry from these gentlemen, but I'm a Californian originally. I've lived in Texas for many years. This is my second stint. I actually live in Dallas, but I run our North American development business out of our Houston office. I've been in the power and the wind sector. I started my first wind company 25 years ago. I was an unemployed real estate developer, and the big those of you old enough to remember the S&L and the real estate meltdown in the second half of the 80s, I was in the middle of that, and I got excited about the power business because power costs are astronomical in the Caribbean islands and places like that. And I think I read an article in Popular Mechanics that said, well, you know, wind and solar are getting a lot more. This is before the internet, by the way. And I tried to talk my old boss into. I said, hey, let's start a wind energy development company because we're trying to develop hotels in the Caribbean and stuff like that. And he thought I was friggin' nuts. So anyway, I started a wind energy development company, and I sold the first business to the Zilka family, which Michael and Salim Zilka had an oil and gas company based out of here. And just to give you an idea of the growth of the power business, myself and my original partners, we sold our first business to the Zilkas for about just under $10 million. The Zilkas sold it to Goldman Sachs later, and these are not maybe totally public numbers, but well north of $100 million and a back-end interest. And then Goldman sold it 3 or 4 years later to Energia de Portugal for $1.3 billion. So from 10 to 150 to 1.3 billion. And then I started another company, but I'm still working because I always sell companies when I'm running out of money instead of when I'm flush. So here I am.
All right. Thanks, George. Maybe I'll start with John, if you don't mind, taking us through what's driving these cost reductions for solar, residential, commercial, and utility scale, and how do you see this panning out going forward?
Well, I think it's, and especially for this crowd, look, we're the largest solar company in Houston, and so that usually did not get me that many kudos or good conversation pieces at night on the cocktail parties and such. But the reality is that Houston ought to be, own everything, and we ought to be involved in everything. As much as I heard the previous gentleman talk about the wonders of technology and fracking and all that, that's all true, and I really believe maybe even more so than they do. You need to look at the technology side here. Too often, whether it's clean or dirty or whatever that means, it's been politicized too much, and it colors and it frankly gets you to think about things incorrectly. I don't hate coal. I don't hate gas. In fact, I love gas. In fact, Candidly, gas and solar have more in common from our perspective than, say, solar and wind. Wind is a rotating technology. I think wind's great, and George sounds like he's made a lot of money doing it. He's going to continue to make a lot of money doing it. I think it's great. But the point is that it's technology, and it's solid-state technology. And the same, in terms of solar, that's happened over in the chip technology areas, what I started to see a few years ago is exactly what's driven down the cost of solar and will continue to drive down the cost of solar. Now, what's not well known is, or appreciated, I would say, is solar is the cheapest form of energy out there. That's already over. What's not over is that hydrocarbons are still the cheapest way of storing a BTU for when you need it. That's under a threat now with storage. And so then as wind comes in as well, because wind's making some, obviously made a lot of great strides on the centralized side of things, but solar can only be centralized, it can be decentralized as well. And so that's where you'll see some differences between what I talk about and maybe what George talks about. But at the end of the day, what's happening is solid state technology, as you ramp up and you get incremental efficiencies, just as you've seen in the chip technology area for the last 40, 45 years, you're dropping that cost down, and incrementally the energy density is increasing on the panels. And we've seen that. That's going to continue. And every time somebody puts a theoretical maximum out there, a few years later it's shattered and you move on up in terms of the energy efficiency, which is now approaching the mid-20s for commercially viable in terms of efficiency. About 30%, I would say, is pretty much game over in terms of the amount, in terms of the cost of the BTU, if you will, or kilowatt hour, or megawatt hour you generate from solar. The same is true if you look, and you've toured, which I've done, on the battery manufacturing plants. They'd use a lot of the same methodologies and processes, and that's coming out in terms of bringing down the cost curve much faster for a couple of reasons. One is everybody's very excited about electric vehicles, and I know we'll have a lot of folks that don't like it, don't think it's really going to work and everything else, and count me in that camp up to about 2 years ago. But something is certainly happening around the world, and those costs are dropping. So as those auto manufacturers, for better or for worse, ramp up, those are dropping those costs down. The second thing is that if you look at it, people are getting more and more, we can come in, my company, for instance, we need to buy scale batteries. So we didn't have that kind of price signal with solar. You didn't really need solar. There was plenty of gas, there was plenty of coal, plenty of nuke, plenty of wind. And what happened, though, is that solar came down the cost curve, but we need storage as solar. And so what we're doing is coming in and putting orders and developing a cost curve for the manufacturers that they're following much, much faster. And so I can tell you my company is struggling to keep up with the demand increases. Forecasts that we made as recently as the beginning of the year, we just blown through all that in terms of demand, and we're really struggling to keep up with the demand and what's changing out there in the marketplace. So what we said earlier, he couldn't be more right. Things are absolutely taking off out there, and there's a lot of change going on. It has a lot to do with the cost reductions.
Thanks, John. George, on the wind side, what are the technology drivers there on the cost side?
Well, it's interesting that John mentions that the cost curve in wind has dropped dramatically, in fact, frankly, faster than I thought. And part of it is the manufacturers being squeezed, but part of it is, wind it's not rocket science. I mean, basically, and the size of your generator, which we call the nameplate rating of the turbine, which is the same in a traditional fossil fuel power plant. If you have a 2 megawatt generator, if you only have a 90-meter rotor on it, you're going to produce far less power than if you have the same nameplate rating and you have a 100 or 120-meter rotor on it. And that's primarily how the cost efficiencies in the wind, just in addition to more competition, but in essence, your rotor swept area is your horsepower. But I might add, as John mentioned, the gas industry and the wind and solar and storage, we should all be allies, because gas is an important balancing mechanism. As I think John alluded to it, maybe not have said it explicitly, but the sun doesn't shine, the wind doesn't blow all the time, and that's why you need gas to help balance the system. Now, as storage becomes increasingly cost effective, it's going to be interesting to see what happens. But I mean, just in Texas, for example, and I tell people this, and I don't know how many of you all know this, but on certain days in Texas, there's 20,000 megawatts of installed megawatts of wind farms in Texas. 20,000 megawatts. It's the equivalent of about 8 or 9 nuclear power plants. When the wind is cranking in Texas on some days, wind is providing half of the power. And year in, year out now, it's up to 20%. That's a really cool thing. It's also bad sometimes because, frankly, there's too much wind in Texas at certain times because of the because of the production tax credit, and we'll go negative pricing to get the tax credit, which I guess is good in one sense, but it's not. It's bad for the system because the gas guys, Texas only, the ERCOT is an energy-only market. And they don't pay people to have capacity. They don't pay people to have their gas plant standing by to provide power when they need it. So when the wind is ramping up and demand is low, the prices plummet, gas guys can't afford to run because they can't afford to provide auxiliary services, or they can't afford to compete, period, because there's not a price signal for them. So you can make the argument that wind and solar is going to probably contribute to that issue. And in fact, in California, you've had so much solar installed. I don't know how many people here have ever heard of the California duck curve. The California duck curve is there is so much solar in California now that they've installed because of their desire to be green. They've installed so much solar that the California PPAs used to all that have on-peak, they were diurnally priced. They'd have on-peak, which was May through September, 12 to 6 p.m., Monday through Friday. That was the peak demand. When everybody's running their air conditioning, the factories are humming, all these things are happening, and they've installed, and so they paid a premium. If you had like a $80 or $90 or $100 PPA price for megawatt hour, they would pay you that plus 120 or 130% during those peak hours. Well, because of the solar proliferation, now in the open market in California, the on-peak hours of those hours, power is given away. They can't give the power away. They're trying to ship it to Nevada. They're trying to ship it up to the Northwest. And so the storage technology, you can't build a new solar project in California if you don't have a storage component attached to it. Now they still have they're very green out there, they're very progressive, and whether you like that or not, they're determined to increase their renewables penetration even more, and that is going to dictate storage. So anyway, the gas guys and the wind guys and the solar guys, we should all be buddies. The gas guys really don't like us anymore because we are a very disruptive market for us in Texas. It's very difficult to build a new gas plant here because prices are so friggin' low because of wind, and also because of the new solar that's coming online. So it's an interesting conundrum, but with the storage thing coming into play, there is a huge energy revolution coming into play. And as John alluded to, the price of the storage is dropping so fast, and the same thing happened in solar. Solar prices, would you say, John? I would say 5 years ago they thought it was going to cost X to build a solar plant, and the efficiency was going to be Y. And whatever they predicted 5 years ago, it's that divided by 2.
In 9 years, it dropped 90%.
So it's real, it's happening. I get people all the time, my oil and gas buddies say, you guys just survived because of the tax credits, and I just say, that's bullshit. We have the tax credits right now, they're going away, we're still the cheapest, and there will be a transitional period when the tax credits go away. But ultimately, if you don't believe that power is a 2-cent commodity forever, wind, solar, and storage are likely going to take over the power industry.
Okay. Thanks, George. So just to make the point, California's 25% of their energy needs is solar and wind. When I say energy needs, that's power generation, and this is not too dissimilar in Texas. But I wanted to get Jason on this. So a big part of this story is the building sector. And the reason we say that is, when you consume power, you have to obviously doing it in buildings. So about 70% of power consumption comes from the building sector. 40% of total energy comes from the building sector. What's happening in the building sector, Jason, around energy efficiency, smart technologies, and so on and so forth?
I mean, you probably can guess the punchline now. We are moving rapidly to renewable energy. And this is a big point for all of us as an investor conference here. This is an important point for everybody to leave here with a firm grasp on, which is wind and sunshine are free. And that means once the infrastructure is installed, you have free energy. And no matter how good the data gets or how good the algorithms get, eventually you're going to be all other energy forms are going to be in a world competing against free energy. And that's like the simplest way to say it. So I actually don't think it's much of a conundrum at all. It's about how to manage the transition. We are the first dealer for Tesla for their Powerwall product, not dealer, retailer. We're their only retail partner for their Powerwall product. And we are actively talking people out of getting batteries for their homes because Tesla can't make them fast enough for us. And this is just first generation. It's a marketplace winner, and it's a lot of fun to see people sort of have the paradigm shift of, I can own my own power production and storage. And so it's really exciting. And I think Texas is the greatest country in America, and I'm really eager for Texas to get a hold of this because I don't want Houston to be the next Detroit. Right? Detroit was a little bit late to the game. I work in retail, and I can't tell you how many retailers said for years and years, like, Amazon can't do what we do. Amazon can't do what we do. And it's like a bunch of baloney. Like, absolutely they can, and they're going to, by the way. And so I think there's still a lot of money to be made in oil and natural gas, but everybody needs to read the script here and understand that we're moving on to a form of energy that's much better in every way. We have a nuclear fusion reactor in the sky. And when it stops making energy, we will have bigger problems than market prices to deal with. But until then, we have free energy raining down on the earth every day, and the technology has arrived to capture it. We at Treehouse, our solar program is, I will make up numbers to keep it simple. We have a financing program, because I think people would rather own than lease, typically. And we finance it such that if your solar system produces $100 of power or energy per month, your note will be $100 per month. And so we say at Treehouse, the only reason not to get solar is if you have shade or you're bad at math. Those are the only reasons anymore not to get solar. And soon, and the efficiencies are going up, so soon I will be able to pay people to put solar on their roof. Because in my business model, I can sell them insulation and batteries and other things as well. And so it's a nice sort of, I'll use energy as a loss leader in my business. And so it's a brave new world. And so what I want to happen, you're seeing this in the auto industry, they're starting to talk about themselves not as car companies, but as mobility companies. And I think there's a moment for companies that have historically thought of themselves as oil and gas companies to begin thinking of themselves as energy companies. Because it's still early days, and there's still plenty of time to move and to groove and to shake and to do some roll-ups and all kinds of fun stuff, because it's still a very young industry despite how far we've gotten.
Okay. So there's a lot in there, so I wanted to unpack it a little bit. So surely there's solar panels on rooftops, and there's large-scale solar facilities and wind. But when we sort of think about how quickly these technologies can grow, they obviously have grown historically. I think there's a couple of things where I think George mentioned that sometimes there's too much solar. A lot of people talk about 100% solar, and what does that mean? What happens at night? Can you maybe talk about some of these challenges in terms of what happens when, even if you get to a 20% solar, there are times in the year when there's just way too much solar and you have to park it. What does that mean in terms of getting more solar in? And so maybe whoever wants to take this one.
I'll start. I have opinions, and if you don't like them, I have others. So I don't mind talking. We just opened our Dallas store, Treehouse did. And the whole building, it's the first net positive commercial building in America. And we have 2 giant Tesla power packs. That means we run the building on 100% sunshine all day. We have 500 solar panels on the roof, which produce more power than we need during the day, and it just charges the batteries. And then at night, we're still running that thing on sunshine. And even after that, we are still dumping energy back into the grid because our batteries fill up. We're using everything the solar panels produce, and then we're still dumping energy back to the grid. For a little while, Dallas bought back the credits for us, and eventually the city of Dallas said, no mas, and now we're not donating energy to the city of Dallas, and that's from one store, from one building. And Treehouse is still we have 3 stores, we're still a young company. We're not a Fortune 500 company by any stretch, and it was a very financially reasonable thing for us to do. And so storage, even in first generation storage, it is already a marketplace winner, even for a company with limited resources. I'm sure you guys have something to say about storage as well.
Yeah, from our perspective, I found the company deliver better service at a better price. And, candidly, we've just been delivering up until very recently just a better price. Was that in some cases due to some of the local subsidies a few years ago? Yes. Largely, ironically, the only two cities in the United States that have any sort of subsidies left on local level are Austin and San Antonio, right? Everything else is gone. I fought the investment tax credit extension. So I didn't want it, and for precisely the reason that George said, all of you guys and ladies think that that's what we're doing up here is we're because of the government. And you're dead wrong. And I'd like to see those credits gone so that, stop subsidizing, which I said was going to happen. It started to at least try to happen, coal and nuke and everything else, and we'll only leave the gas guys without subsidy. That's not the business we all want to be in. But really, we have deregulation because in terms of storage, what we're seeing right now, if you look in Puerto Rico, for instance, and Hawaii is another place that people are coming in and saying, look, I need protection from the storms. I need to have higher reliability. 18% of U.S. households have some sort of either whole home generator or a major generator within the garage. 18%, so almost 1 in 5 homes. So clearly, 20% of the population believes that the grid, no matter where you are, is not good enough in terms of the level of service that they're going out there. And those have been great business for Generac and Kohler to be in. Now you're doing what Jason's talking about, is putting a battery in there. And boy, that cuts down on permitting, a lot of hassle and everything else. But more importantly, as Jason was talking about, is now I can use that cheap, free, you're right, zero variable cost energy at night, and I can provide that level of service that you're not going to get from the utility no matter where you are, no matter what fuel's being used. And that's a key driver. So if we then come in and we deliver a better service, which is what we're starting to do now, in terms of putting that generation where you need it on your home, and I can beat the grid, then we've delivered a better service at a better price. And in a free market, which we need to make sure we get in the U.S. power industry in this country, and the closest thing we have to it is Texas, I think both you guys said that, then we should win, as long as we're doing a good job with the customer. And that's where I think the future's going. And the reality is we are starting to have conversations on both the federal level and the state level about redoing the regulatory structures, because the technology is blown past the regulators in both the states and the federal level, and we need to look at how do we reorganize this and deal with the reality that the technology has changed completely, and not only has changed, but is changing even more rapidly.
Yep.
Those are all good comments. And somebody mentioned, or I think it was Jason mentioned, that his electricity is basically free. I mean, frankly, I'm in the business of selling wholesale power. So I would love, as most of you in this room probably would, I would love to see natural gas prices back up at $8 or $9 per million BTU. That would make my life so much easier, because I would, not only would my prices be high, I would get a much better margins on my wind projects, because natural gas is the primary driver of avoided costs in most of the electricity markets around the country. But it is an interesting conundrum when you mention that the cost of energy is approaching zero, because for a wind or solar plant, your fuel costs are zero, of course. So your costs for your project are your upfront capital costs, and then your operating costs, which are historically, and solar costs are even lower than wind costs, but that's the cost of your business. And so it's a capital cost and your operating costs. And that's the thing that keeps me up at night wondering about our business, because the cost of electricity in a flat demand life cycle or period right now, the cost of electricity with wind and solar is approaching zero. And all of us that have to sell something for a living, that's not a sustainable business model. There has to be a value on our product. And so I would love to see natural gas prices get higher, but I can tell you that coal and nuclear, they're going to be around for a while, but long term, they're done. It's just going to be, it's a factor. Now, one other thing I should mention is that there are, on a utility system, for the folks that are doing rooftop solar, I'm on the wholesale side of electricity. I build large-scale commercial products. These gentlemen are more into the distribution, residential business side. And there are very real issues on a grid putting a lot of amount of power out on the end of the distribution in the homes and the small businesses, because the power traditional in the utility system, the power is flowing from large central power stations out to the extremities. And so when you put, when you put a lot of little rooftop solar, storage facilities and substations and houses and homes, everything, the power all of a sudden is going backwards. It's a significant issue, and the utilities in Arizona and Nevada, where they had retail programs and they had things, they've gone to their legislatures to try to get in reverse, because it has cost. There are very real issues with integrating large-scale renewables, particularly in the distribution voltage, into the grid, and so that's going to be a big challenge. But as both these gentlemen mentioned, there is truly an energy revolution going on, and it's going to happen faster than we all think it is.
Thanks, George. So I just wanted to summarize. So the cost of solar and wind is cheaper than other technologies. There's a lot to be worked on from a regulatory standpoint. Arguably one of the things, as John pointed out, was storage. That once you're ahead of the cost barrier, the only barrier is how much more solar can you get. And once you have storage, then it's a 24-hour cycle. You don't have to worry about night or day or intermittency to some extent. So on that piece, I just wanted to add one question to the panel. Maybe I'll start with John. Where are we on the cost curve of solar plus storage or wind plus storage together?
Well, it is a very nascent market. I was in China back in August, and everybody there was just focused on electric vehicles, and that was it. And that's pretty much been true for North America as well, right up until Maria flattened Puerto Rico. And then literally my company stepped in. We bought all the batteries that we could. Maybe Jason bought a couple of them as well.
We couldn't get in.
Yeah, and it really.
We own a $200 million project in Puerto Rico, and we haven't been online since the hurricane.
We've got about 75% back online, but and we're about ready to finish that up. But the point being is it's very new. Everybody was just focused on electric vehicles, and that was it. And so when we started calling around saying we're willing to pay 3 or 4x of what they were selling to General Motors or Nissan or any of these guys, that surprised a lot of them. And now folks have re-geared. They started to look at the industry differently. Tesla, I know, is ramping up the Powerwall when they were, mostly and still are focused on EVs, but at least started to let more supply through. So things are changing and changing rapidly. So you'll get price quotes all over the map. And it depends on how much you're buying. If you're buying 2 or 5 or 10 versus 2,000, that's a very different price point. And if you look at where I think what we do and what I would suggest everybody does that's running an energy company, oil, gas, conventional, centralized power, utility, poles and wires, monopoly, whatever, is I would look at the cost of storage on a wholesale level, either weekly or monthly. And that tells me where I need to go as far as my business. And right now what we're seeing is that we're economically viable up against the grid. It's shooting fish in a barrel. Hawaii, everything in the Pacific Islands, the Caribbean, which includes obviously Puerto Rico, but now starting with California as well, because they have a tiered pricing structure there. But we now expect, after the last couple of days, huge demand we're starting to see in the Northeast. People are, thinking about Sandy again and so forth. But there's also relatively higher power prices in the Northeast as well. But then you also look at the Southwest, where you got a lot of solar generation. Basically, it's very sunny. And that's starting to be where you don't have net metering, like in Houston and Dallas. We're starting to see a lot of demand there. Because, again, people are coming in and going, I can have reliability, and I can pair this up with solar that's now cheap. So it caught us by surprise, to be quite candid about it, about how widespread the demand is. But I would also say that outside the islands and in some of the coast and the West Coast, it's not economically viable yet. Just give it a few, I always say 2 years, and then it happens in 6 months in solar and storage. But I think it's coming much faster than people think, where even in Houston, Texas, it'll be viable to put storage and solar in your home.
If gas were $8 and that was driving the price of electricity, it would be viable right now at 2 cents. When I say eight, in power, we generally think in terms of dollars per megawatt hour. Most people, when they think of electricity, they say cents per kilowatt hour. I know the solar guy is still talking cents per kilowatt hour. But actually, we're solar guys too. But I'm
Yeah, no, you just.
I'm kind of a wind weenie. But I just gave away that I'm wind prejudiced just because I've done that longer. But no, is John and Jason mentioned wind or solar and storage. You could repower Puerto Rico, Hawaii, any island grid that is just basically powered right now by heavy reciprocating cycle diesel, old grinder generators. You could repower all those guys right now with solar and storage, and they could provide power cheaper to their residents than their current systems. It's a cut and dried case.
Thanks, George. Sorry, just in the interest of time, we do have to talk about electrification, but maybe just looking for one number here. I'll put you on the spot a little bit. Once you sort of incorporate all the commercial challenges, the technical challenges, how quickly do you think the U.S. as a whole and all the systems in it, power systems in it, can go to 80% renewables? Just how many years do you think? Best case?
I think, so the limiting factor, you wanted just a quick answer.
That's fine.
1 or 2 generations. So on the fast side, if we have the will, in 30 years, we'll move to supermajority renewable energy power. Worst case, 2 generations, 60 years to supermajority renewable energy powered.
Okay. So two generations?
It depends on how many old generators we bring online, because once we deploy the capital to bring a new generator online of non-renewable, we're going to run it to the end of its life, which is 30 to 50 years.
Got it.
If we stop that, 1 generation. If we don't stop that, 2 generations.
Got it.
I don't know about 80%, but everything in technology moves in an S curve, right? And I don't see this as any different this time. I think that within the next 15, 20 years, it'll dominate. Solar and storage will dominate, with having wind having a good chunk of it as well. I would say that's not really the question to ask. Is when do you? I had somebody say, "Well, I want to sell the last barrel or the last ton of coal." Well, I don't want to do that. I don't want to sell the last solar panel out there if something else comes along, like real fusion here on Earth. But I think it's really about how does that affect the business, and when does certain businesses in the so-called conventional energy become just not really that interesting. And candidly, coal's been there for 10 years, right? So I want to get out of those businesses and into the growth areas well before, and not really necessarily concern myself whether we end up at 80% in 15 years or it ends up being 60% in 15 years.
Okay. Thanks. George, what's your number?
Yeah,
Not a fair question, I know, but
Sorry?
not a fair question, but
No,
curious.
I think you're going to see a fair amount. You're going to see a fair amount. You're going to see a lot of fossil and gas, coal and gas, and you're going to see a lot of the nukes stay alive for a while because you have political issues. Depending on how green your state is, how much you believe in global warming, how much you believe that coal and fossil fuels need to be phased out sooner rather than later. But I can see, wind is 6 or 7 or 8% of the total installed nameplate in the country. What is solar up to now?
About 2.5.
2.5. Anyway, the last 10 years, let me put it this way, in the last 10 years, 75% of all the investment in the power generation industry worldwide has been in wind and solar. 75%. That's where all the money is going. So it's gas is going to stay around, coal is going to stay around because you have a coal plant that's 30 or 40 years old, and all you have to do is shove coal into the generator, and the capital costs of that plant were written off long ago, and you have local jobs to think about. There is going to be lots of politics and lots of issues surrounding that, but I can see wind, solar, and storage. A third to a half of the grid within the next 10 to 15, certainly within the next 20 years.
Okay. And the reason I asked that is, when you think about transition and sort of away from fossil fuels to renewables, one piece of the puzzle is how fast you can get renewables in the power system, which seems like, 1 generation, 15, 20 years or more. So not anything anytime soon, right? The other side to this is you get more and more renewables in the power system, but let's also electrify transport. I know it's a loaded question, but we are running short of time. Maybe just, if you go through the panel, how do you think about electrification, and how fast can it catch up?
Very fast. I think every major automaker has announced profound initiatives into electric vehicles. The only sort of hitch in the giddy up I see out there is, as somebody raised it earlier, sort of the issue of quote unquote non-renewables in batteries. And they're referring to mostly the quote unquote rare earth groups. Any geologists in the room know that rare earth elements aren't actually rare. They just occur in clumps, and so you can go a long time without finding them. But when you find them, we tend to find a lot of them. And unlike other renewable energies, when they're used in battery systems, they're not consumed, right? They're not annihilated. So a nickel lithium battery can be recycled at the end of its life. And so they're non-renewable in the sense that stars aren't supernovaing close enough by to make more nickel and lithium. But they are renewable in the sense that we know how to recycle batteries. And so I think it is happening and will continue to happen. The good news is I think we're on the verge of a blossoming space industry. And I hope Houston goes hard after that. And I can't think of a fuel source with a high enough impulse energy to lift a rocket outside of a combustion engine. And so maybe somebody should go gobble up rocket contracts and hunting. So.
Thanks, Jason. John?
I think it's really a question of the IT side of this thing. We haven't really touched on that, but it is really key. And a lot of the technologies you're seeing are spilling over into our space that you see in the, some of the other spaces out there, referenced Amazon earlier, Jason. Are we going to go autonomous and have fleets, or is this going to be just the same old, the way everybody buys one car, drives it 1 hour, 1 day, just got one person in it? I think we're going to go more to the autonomous. I think that's the general trend if you look at Uber and Lyft and so forth, and I know that's a whole other set of discussions. If that happens, I think that the electrification is going to happen much faster. The other thing is that I think the energy demand is going to drop a lot more, and so any sort of, quote, burden on the grid isn't going to actually materialize.
Thanks, John. George?
Yeah, the EV business, I thought it was a flash in the pan until a year, not a flash in the pan, but I didn't think it was going to be anything significant, but it is clearly gaining momentum. Fossil fuels, oil is still by far the most energy-dense way to store electricity, no doubt about it. But as batteries are getting cheaper and cheaper, more efficient, the electric vehicles are getting increasingly attractive. And then you start getting, T-Boone, remember T-Boone was doing the Pickens plan 10 years or so, where he was going to get big into wind, and he spent $50 million on TV ads, and he should have hired me. He never put 1 megawatt on the ground. He bought a bunch of GE turbines, and then he ended up selling them for a loss because his big Texas Panhandle deal, it didn't work. But his plan was basically to get a lot of wind going so they could free up gas, and then he wanted to get gas into the transportation business. And what kind of foiled that plan was that people weren't ready for the infrastructure to put the gas charging, like you go to the gas station, you put gas in your car, but you can't just pull up and put storage in your car. And as EV storage stations become more prevalent and they get high voltage where you can go in and instead of sitting there for 2 hours or 3 hours or 4 hours of charging your car, if you can charge your car in 15 minutes, that's going to change. That will be a game changer. And how many people have actually driven a Tesla or electric car? They are rocket ships. They go to 0 to 60 in about 2 seconds. They literally. My boss has a Tesla, and we were driving out in California a couple months ago, and we were out in the remote stretch. I just floored it. And it's like being in a rocket ship. You're just pressed back in the seat like you're taking off in a jet engine. They are tons of fun. And when they're reliable, and when you can drive 250 miles without have to, if you're halfway between Midland and Houston, and you can stop and charge your vehicle in 15 minutes, and it costs just the same as a gas car, I think it's a game changer.
Thanks, George. And I'll just add to this, you can sort of be on either side of the argument, electric cars are going to happen or not, or this panel is saying one way or the other. But the truth of the matter is, when we look at these issues, we've seen Volvo is not going to make any new ICE engine after 2019, right? Toyota's making hydrogen cars and electric cars. There's countries that have banned the production of ICE engines in the 2030s. So this is not this panel saying, this is a whole different discussion, but if you look at sort of where the money is flowing, there's a lot of money flowing into electric cars, which is obviously going to have a sort of a multiplier impact in terms of the R&D that goes into battery storage and electric cars. But with that, I wanted to maybe get to the Q&A piece. There's about 10 of these, won't get to each one. How many? 2? Okay. There is so I'll start with this. Electric cars and storage consume many batteries. How successful are they at recycling, or is there an environmental impact? Who wants to?
I guess I opened the can, so I'll launch off out there. The recycling industry is small and nascent, but it's known technology. It just needs to be scaled. There's not a ton of it online that I'm aware of. Elon Musk, who makes wonderful promises all the time, but he has promises that he will bring online capacity to recycle all Tesla batteries, and it actually makes a ton of sense to do so. Once you've extracted and refined the elements inside of a battery, it's a lot easier to reprocess the old batteries than it is to go dig for new material. And if we run out of material here on Earth, we will go get more from space. And so I don't see any big limiter.
Okay. So I'm running through all of them. How long can current battery technology hold the charge? I mean, just a quick answer, maybe.
What kind of battery?
Current batteries, how long can they hold one charge?
Well, frankly, I mean, I just know what I see from when I read the Tesla or when my friends tell me. But basically, I think the top range of the best electric cars right now is about 250 miles.
Yep. Okay.
And translating that into a house, the power walls, the recommendation is for every 2 bedrooms, you need a power wall. And that assuming you size it appropriately, should power a house for about 8 hours at full everything running. I mean, maybe if you have some amazing sound system theater in your house, you might need an extra one for that. But
okay.
You know what's amazing is people ever heard of Bitcoin mining in this room? There's some articles. It's the most. I didn't even. One of my guys in my company came to me and says, "You know what? We need to put a wind farm out there up in Northwest Washington because these Bitcoin guys up there." But it's like the guys are growing pot in their houses in California with all the heat lamps going and they're consuming massive amounts of electricity. Well, this Bitcoin thing that these people are doing, and they're doing them out in these remote areas where they could buy cheap power. Well, all of a sudden they got some area, they got some little warehouse that was that was consuming 5 or 10 kilowatt hours a month, and all of a sudden this thing is consuming 5 megawatt hours a month. I mean, it's just, I don't know what these computer algorithms are doing, but they are just crunching data and consuming power like crazy. So some of us in the wind business and the power business and the solar and the gas business, everybody that wants to see more electricity consumed, we're going, we like bit mining because we need some more of those out in West Texas to soak up some of that excess wind power.
One overall comment I would say, maybe just to end my comments on, is that there's a lot of, whether it's recycling batteries or maybe serving the cryptocurrency market, whatever it is, there's a lot of opportunities out there, and that's really what I think that we should be focused on, particularly as Houston and Texas is. Let's go out there and find those opportunities and not be scared of them, not run away because it's not oil and gas or coal or whatever it is that we're used to. Let's get out of our comfort zone. Let's move. Let's change. Let's go with it. There's a lot of money to be made out there. So there's one side of the coin that says that what we do is a threat. There's the other side of the coin that I think everybody should look at is it's an opportunity. Yep. Go find it.
I'll say one more thing about Texas, too, because we should all be proud to be Texans. I'm a transplanted Texan. But, in the rest of the country where the renewables have grown like crazy, it's been largely kind of a politically driven phenomenon. And when W was governor of Texas and he came up with the original Texas 2000, we were going to build 2,000 megawatts of wind between, I think it was 2001 and 2008. Something like that. W was basically the father of Texas wind because he challenged the state legislature to do this, and they made it, wind, it's easy to permit out in West Texas. The farmers, the business communities welcomed us, and we blew through that notion. And then Texas built the CREZ lines, the competitive renewable energy zones, to facilitate the expansion of renewables in Texas. And the industry blew through that. And that's all private industry. It was, of course, the production tax credits helped to make us cheap, but it wasn't Washington deliver. It wasn't a Democratic mandate. We got to save the world for renewable power. It was like, hey, let's have cheap power. Let's build some transmission lines. So we should all be very proud of what we've accomplished in Texas. Okay. Thanks.
So there's a bunch of different questions. I'm going to paraphrase these questions into sort of one big question. There's generally a lot of, when you're talking about a whole transition from one sort of bunch of fuels to others, There's a lot of known knowns and unknown unknowns. There's what we don't know, what we don't know. Do you anticipate those sort of challenges coming up, and do you have any guesstimates on what those could be? I mean, they're unknowns, so it's kind of not a smart question, but
What the unknowns are?
or could be, yeah.
I think it's regulatory. I think government interference always creates, whether it's well-intended or not, it always creates unintended consequences, many of times which are bad. And for those that are in the oil and gas business, this is a little foreign to y'all, and you're really looking at how do I get the regulators off my back. The current administration's done a lot of that, and I think that's good. But what y'all don't understand is the power business, like CenterPoint. The more money they spend, the more money they make. It's not capitalism in the power industry, and the centralized generation business here in Houston and Dallas only is really quasi-capitalism. We need full capitalism, full markets, consumer choice in all the power industry. And if we don't get it, we're going to see things like we saw earlier last year, which is, it's unthinkable. Should we subsidize coal? Should we subsidize nuclear? We're subsidizing a lot of things. The change that would be happening right now with what all of us are talking about would actually be going a lot faster if the government provided free markets and consumer choice and capitalism. And that needs to happen. If it doesn't happen, you could do things like keep coal around far longer than it should be, for instance.
I agree with that, but there is, the utility model, what is he referring to in the utility business? We always say because there's a growing trend in the utility business because the utilities, wind and solar are getting so cheap, there's an increasing trend on the wholesale side of the power business. The utilities go, boy, I'd sure like to own the wind farm myself instead of just buying the power. It's like T. Boone Pickens owns with his American Electric Power. He owns NV Energy, owns Pacificor. He's got a big chunk. He's buying wind turbines and installing them like crazy. And we don't like competing particularly against the utilities because they're regulated monopolies. And so if they build something for $100 million and they can prove that there's a need or show their PUC, as John's referring to it, they get their cost recovery. So they get a guaranteed rate of return. We don't have a guaranteed rate of return in our business. We're competing against everybody else in the market. But having said that, there is whether you're keeping a coal plant around or a gas plant around, there are the utility, there's always two sides to every coin, but there are counterbalancing arguments that you got to keep the lights on. How fast can you transition to a totally wind, solar, and storage-related market and not have an unstable grid? Or how much rooftop and residential and small business solar and storage can you have before your grid because someone still has to manage the grid. So there are legitimate issues, but with all the smart people around everything, these are all surmountable problems.
I'll talk at a higher general level. I know this is supposed to be about renewable energy. For most of human history, when you were born, you could expect to die in a world that was only slightly different than the world you were born in. We are entering a phase of history where the world is going to be very different. And I don't mean like in 60 years, I mean in like 5, 10, 15, 20-year kinds of time frames. I just got back from an art exhibit where a woman was picking up cigarette butts, extracting the DNA, sequencing it, and could print masks that almost exactly look like the person who smoked the cigarette that she found on the street. And that's not future state, that is today. I am 3D printing houses in Austin. We are going to be traveling into space. And so as investors, you're going to have to be way more nimble than investors at any time in history. But this room, and maybe this is where I'll stop talking, this is a room full of queen makers, and this is a room full of king makers. And what I mean is, you know this about yourselves, this is the kind of room full of people who have an outsized hand in shaping the future. And the future is up for grabs like it has never been, or it has been, but only at a few periods in history if you're students of history. And I hope you all take that responsibility very seriously and to make, I am so excited to be alive right now. This is really, really cool. And what a cool time to be an investor and to have an opportunity to really shape a world and not just kind of like move through the world. So the unknown unknowns are a lot of change really fast.
Yep. Thanks to the panel. I'm going to end with this quickly, just to summarize, and please raise your hand if I'm summarizing anything wrongly. But When we talk about, when I ask a question where electric cars are going to happen or not, there's never a binary answer, right? I think George pointed out, and John did, and Jason did too. You surmount these problems. If you sort of Google electric vehicles and you look at a news article from 2015 vintage, they'll talk about the use of rare earth metals. We don't use rare earth metals anymore, right? A lot of people talk about, you're sourcing these batteries from Congo. Not the best place to source anything from. And the truth of the matter is now they're making batteries which don't really use a lot of cobalt. So that's, these problems are being circumvented. Now, the challenge to understanding the pace of this transition is really twofold. One is, how fast can you circumvent these challenges? And that's sort of an unknown. It's an open question to a large part. And really the second question is, the conversation needs to be had. Otherwise, it's going to be a bumpy road one way or the other. The more you have these conversations, the better it is to think about this transition, if, when, and how. Anyway, and with that, thank you so much, panel. This is great. Thank you.